Clara Merritt did not cry when Thomas Hale handed back her ring. She stood on the platform of Coldwater Creek Station with the summer sun burning the back of her neck, and she held herself perfectly still while he told her he had chosen someone else. She watched him board that train without looking back, and she kept her chin up and her hands folded and her face as calm as still water. Then the whistle screamed, the train moved, and something inside Clara Merritt broke clean in two. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning Thomas Hale boarded that train, Clara Merritt had exactly $4.62 in her coin purse, one trunk of belongings, and nowhere to go. She stood on the platform of Coldwater Creek Station long after the dust had settled. The summer heat was the kind that pressed itself against a person like something alive, relentless, without mercy, without apology. Around her, the small frontier town went about its business. Horses moved. Men called to one another across the main street. A woman shook a rug from a second-floor window. Life continued on, the way life always did, utterly indifferent to the fact that Clara's entire future had just pulled out of the station without her. She picked up her trunk. She carried it off the platform herself, because there was no one to carry it for her. And she set it down in front of the station house and stood there with her hands on her hips and her jaw set and tried to think. She was 43 years old. She had buried a husband 5 years ago, sold the farm to cover his debts, and spent the years since keeping herself upright by working as a seamstress and a schoolteacher, and whatever else a capable woman could find to occupy herself with. When Thomas Hale came through her town 2 years ago, charming and well-dressed and full of promises about his ranch in the Arizona Territory, she had believed him. She had given notice to her employer. She had packed her life into one trunk and traveled 3 days by train to this town she had never heard of, to marry a man she had apparently never really known. And now, here she was. "That her?" The voice came from 2 women standing not 10 feet away. Clara did not turn her head. "The one left on the platform," the other woman said. Quieter, but not quiet enough. "Word is he had a woman waiting for him up in Tucson the whole time. Rich widow." "Lord Almighty! He brought this one all the way out here first? Cruel thing to do. Well," a pause. "She ought to have known better." Clara turned. She looked at both women directly, the way her mother had taught her. Steady gaze, level chin, no apology in it. "I'm standing right here," she said. Both women had the grace to color slightly. They moved on without another word. Clara exhaled slowly. She reached into her coin purse, counted what she had, and made herself think practically. She needed lodging. She needed to find out if there was any work in this town. She needed, in short, to survive the next 24 hours without coming apart at the seams. She could do her grieving later, in private, where it belonged. She had just bent to lift her trunk again when a voice came from behind her. "Ma'am, you need some help with that?" She straightened. The man standing at the edge of the platform was tall and lean, with the kind of face the sun had been working on for years. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he held the brim with 2 fingers in a gesture that might have been a greeting. He was maybe 45, maybe older. His eyes were a quiet gray, and they were looking at her without any of the pity or sharp curiosity she'd been getting from everyone else in town since the 9 o'clock pulled away. "I'm fine," Clara said. "Trunk's near as big as you are," he said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "I've managed heavier." He nodded once, accepting that. He didn't push. He turned to go. "Papa!" Two boys came barreling around the corner of the station house and nearly collided with the man's legs. They were identical, dark-haired, sunburned, missing the same front tooth. They grabbed his coat on both sides and pulled at him simultaneously, talking over each other in the way only twins could manage. "Papa, Hector got out of the pen again, and Mr. Briggs said he's going to shoot him if he comes near his chickens one more. Papa, I told Danny it wasn't my fault, but he keeps saying it was, and—" The man put one large hand on each boy's head. The talking stopped instantly. "One at a time," he said. "Caleb, you first." The boy on the left straightened importantly. "Hector got loose. He's down by the mill." "Danny." "That's what I said," the other boy said. "But Caleb left the gate open." "Did not." "Did too." "Boys." Silence. Both of them looked at their boots. The man crouched down to their level, and though Clara could not hear what he said in that low, measured voice, she watched both boys nod solemnly. Then Caleb said, "Yes, sir," and Danny said, "Sorry, sir." And then both of them looked at her at the exact same moment with the wide, unguarded curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to pretend. "Who's she?" Danny said. "Danny," the man said. "Sorry." Danny looked at her anyway. "Ma'am." "Good afternoon," Clara said. "Are you staying in town?" Caleb asked. He was clearly the more forthcoming of the two. "Caleb," his father said, with a note of warning. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. Something shifted in the boy's expression. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her face. He was 7, maybe 8, and he had the kind of perceptive eyes that children sometimes had, the ones that noticed things adults had learned to walk past. "You look like you're having a real bad day," he said. His father said his name again, with considerably more weight behind it. Clara held up one hand. "He's not wrong," she said. The man looked at her then, not with pity, with something more careful than pity. Something that recognized the particular weight a person carried when they were holding themselves together by sheer force of will in a public place. "Eli Calloway," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Clara Merritt." She did not offer her hand. He did not seem to expect it. "You got somewhere to stay, Miss Merritt?" "I'm working on it." He looked at her trunk. He looked at the empty station behind her. He pressed his lips together briefly, and she could see him deciding something. "May's boarding house is on the far end of Maine," he said. "She's decent. Fair price." "Thank you," he nodded once. "Come on, boys." He started to walk, and the twins fell in on either side of him, and Clara watched the three of them move down the dusty main street. Two small figures flanking the taller one. A family unit so complete and self-contained that the sight of it put a small, unexpected ache somewhere behind her sternum. She picked up her trunk. She walked toward May's boarding house. May turned out to be a stout, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, with a direct handshake and no patience for self-pity. And the room she offered was clean and small and cost 50 cents a day, which Clara could not afford for more than 8 days at her current funds. "You looking for work?" May asked, pouring coffee without being asked. Clara sat at the kitchen table and accepted it gratefully. "I am." "What kind?" "Sewing, teaching, cooking if it comes to that. I've kept books before." May studied her for a moment. "There's a school teacher position. Old Mrs. Dunmore retired in April, and they haven't filled it." "Is there a school board?" "Harold Briggs runs it." May set down her cup. "He runs most things in this town, if you want the truth. He's not an easy man to deal with." "I'm not an easy woman to push around," Clara said. May smiled for the first time. "No," she said, "I can see that." Harold Briggs had an office above the general store, and he received Clara the following morning with the expression of a man being asked to do something inconvenient. He was thick-necked and heavy-handed, with small eyes that took in her travel dress, and her single trunk, and her lack of a husband with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to it to make no difference. "You're the woman Thomas Hale brought out here," he said. Not a question, a label, already decided. "I'm Clara Merritt," she said. "I'm told there's a teaching position available." "There is. We've been particular about who we hire." "I taught school for 7 years in Missouri." Clara opened her bag and placed 2 letters on his desk. "Letter of recommendation from the school superintendent. Another from my church regarding my character." Briggs looked at the letters without picking them up. "You planning on staying in Coldwater Creek?" he asked. "That depends on whether there's a reason to." He picked up one letter. He read it slowly, deliberately, the way a man reads when he wants to seem more important than the task he's performing. "Pays $12 a month," he said finally. "Classes start the 1st of September, 6 weeks out." 6 weeks. She had money for 8 days at Mays. "The position doesn't start sooner?" Clara asked. "School's out for summer." He set the letter down. "The Calloway Ranch puts up a summer cook sometimes. North Pasture. If you're looking for something to tide you over." Clara kept her face still. "The Calloway Ranch. Eli Calloway. You know him?" "We met, briefly." Briggs made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "His regular cook left last month. 2 boys running wild out there all summer. The man's doing his best, but—" he spread his hands. "He's a rancher, not a house manager." "I see," Clara said. "I'm just telling you what I know." Briggs leaned back in his chair. "You want the teaching position, it's yours, pending board approval. In the meantime, if you need income, that's an option worth considering." Clara picked up her letters. She folded them precisely and returned them to her bag. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for exactly 20 minutes, standing on the boardwalk outside Briggs's office, with the summer sun pressing down on the crown of her head and her practical mind running the numbers for the 4th time. 6 weeks was too long to wait. She could stretch her funds to maybe 10 or 11 days if she was careful. And then she would be sleeping on May's goodwill or on the street, and neither of those was a thing she would allow. She had not survived 5 years of widowhood and 2 years of believing a liar, to end up sleeping on the street of a town she'd never asked to be in. She turned and walked toward the livery. The Calloway Ranch sat 3 miles north of town, and May had arranged for the livery boy to drive Clara out in the supply wagon that made the run every Thursday. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the land stretch out in every direction. Dry grass, red rock, a sky so wide and blue it made the world feel very small underneath it. She had not been in Arizona for 2 full days yet, and in that time she had been humiliated, stranded, gossiped about, and offered charity by a man whose name she barely knew. And now she was going to ask that man for a job. She straightened her spine and watched the road. The ranch house was plain and well built, and 2 sets of small boot prints tracked across the dirt near the water pump. She climbed down from the wagon before the boy could offer to help her and walked to the front door. She knocked twice. There was a crash from somewhere inside. Then voices, arguing. Then footsteps. The door opened. Eli Calloway looked at her. He was in his work clothes, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a smear of axle grease on his forearm. He had plainly not been expecting company. He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Merritt," he said. "Mr. Calloway." She kept her voice even. "I understand your cook left last month?" Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, something more like recognition. The look of a man who had been solving problems long enough to recognize when one was solving itself. "Who told you that?" "Harold Briggs." "Of course he did." He looked past her at the wagon pulling away down the road. He looked back at her. "You'd better come in." The kitchen told Clara everything she needed to know. Eli cleared 2 chairs without apologizing for the state of the table, and he set a coffee pot on the stove with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing everything himself for too long. "I've got the teaching position," Clara said, sitting down. "Starting September 1st, 6 weeks from now." "Congratulations," he said, and she heard the genuine quality in it. No condescension, no performance. "I need work between now and then." He was quiet for a moment. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her, and then sat across from her and looked at her the same way he had at the station, direct and without theater. "The boys are a handful," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. Danny's the quieter one, but he gets into more trouble than his brother and never looks sorry about it. Caleb talks from sunup to sundown and has an opinion about everything, and I do mean everything. They're 7. "I taught school for 7 years, Clara said. "I can manage children. This isn't a classroom." "No, but the principles aren't entirely different." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged the whole situation. If Briggs had been wrong, or she had been a fool to come out here alone to ask a near stranger for work. Then he said, "Room, board, and $8 a month. Cooking, some cleaning, keeping an eye on the boys while I'm out on the range. It's not—" He paused. His jaw tightened slightly, the way a man's jaw tightened when he was saying something that cost him something. "It's not what you came to this town expecting." The word landed harder than she'd anticipated. "No," she said. "It isn't. I'm sorry about that. About Hale. It was a low thing he did." "You don't need to apologize for another man's behavior." "No, but someone ought to." She looked at him across the table. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across his hands and across the plain surface between them. And she thought, not for the first time since that train pulled away, and not for the last, that grief had a strange way of making a person read the honesty in strangers with a clarity they hadn't had before. "I'll take the position," she said. He nodded once. He stood and extended his hand. She shook it. Firm, straightforward, no pretense on either side. "I'll have Ruth set up the spare room," he said. "Who's Ruth?" "My sister. She comes out twice a week to help with the boys." Something shifted slightly in his face. "She'll want to talk your ear off. You have fair warning." "I'll survive," Clara said. The spare room was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the back pasture, and Clara sat on the edge of the bed with her trunk at her feet and listened to the house around her. The boys shouting somewhere outside, the wind moving across the flat, open land, the far-off sound of cattle. She had not cried yet. She had made it through the station, and May's boarding house, and Briggs's office, and this kitchen, and this conversation without a single tear, and she intended to hold out a while longer. She pressed her hands flat against her knees. She thought about Thomas Hale on that train, moving toward Tucson and a rich widow, and whatever story he had told himself to make what he'd done acceptable. She thought about her house in Missouri, sold and gone, about the school she had left, about the life she had packed into one trunk and carried 3 days across the country, on the word of someone who had never deserved her faith. She thought about Eli Calloway's face across that table, the directness of it, the absence of performance. Outside, one of the twins, she couldn't tell which one yet, shouted, "It was not my fault!" And the other one shouted back with equal conviction. And then there was a long pause, and then a sound that was either a collision or an embrace. She genuinely could not tell. Despite everything, something loosened in her chest. Just slightly. Just enough. She opened her trunk. She began to unpack. That evening, when she came into the kitchen to start dinner and found both boys sitting at the table watching her with identical solemn faces, she stopped and looked at them. "You're the lady from the station," Caleb said. "I am." "You're staying here now?" "For the summer." Danny studied her with those serious gray eyes, his father's eyes, she realized, sitting in a 7-year-old face. "Our mama died," he said. Not accusing, not performing sadness, just telling her a fact the way children told the most important facts. Plainly, because they had not yet learned to dress them up. Clara looked at him steadily. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Papa doesn't cook very good," Caleb offered. "Caleb," Danny said, scandalized. "It's true." "It's rude." "Papa says honesty is important." Clara turned to the stove before either of them could see the expression on her face. "How do you two feel about biscuits?" she said. There was a pause. The particular pause of children who had been hoping for something and were carefully managing their expectations. "We like biscuits," Caleb said. "Good." Clara reached for the flour. "Then let's get started." She lay on the narrow mattress later that night, long after the boys were in bed, and listened to Eli moving through the house. Quiet, deliberate footsteps. The sound of a man accustomed to being the last one awake. She stared at the ceiling and made herself think forward instead of backward. 6 weeks, $8 a month, a teaching position in September. It wasn't what she had come here for. It wasn't remotely close. But it was solid ground under her feet, and after the last 2 days, solid ground was more than she had any right to expect. She closed her eyes. Outside her window, the Arizona night was vast and star-scattered and enormous. And somewhere out in it, a goat named Hector was apparently still at large near the mill. She would deal with that in the morning. The first morning was a test Clara had not signed up for, but passed anyway. She was at the stove before sunrise, because that was when the boys woke up. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had fired a starting pistol somewhere inside their chests. She heard them hit the floor running. She heard the argument begin before they were fully down the stairs. She had the coffee on and the biscuits already in the pan by the time Danny came skidding into the kitchen, with Caleb 3 steps behind him, and both of them talking at the same time. "He took my boot." "It was my boot." "They're the same boots. Mine has the scratch on the left side. That's how you know they're mine, because you scratched it." Clara turned from the stove. She looked at both of them with a particular expression she had once used on a classroom of 32 Missouri schoolchildren who had collectively decided that a substitute teacher meant a holiday. It was not a mean expression. It was simply immovable. Both boys stopped talking. "Good morning," she said, a beat. "Good morning, ma'am," they said, nearly in unison. "Sit down. Biscuits in 10 minutes. They sat. The boot dispute was apparently resolved without further negotiation, because neither of them mentioned it again. Eli came in from the barn while she was pulling the pan from the oven. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at both boys sitting quietly at the table. And then he looked at Clara, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "Mornin'," he said. "Morning." She set the pan on the stovetop. "Coffee's ready." He poured his own cup, and she noticed, without meaning to, that he did it without expecting to be served. He leaned against the counter and drank it standing, the way a man drank when he had 100 things waiting for him, and sitting down felt like a luxury he hadn't earned yet. "I'm moving cattle to the north pasture today," he said. "Should be back before supper." "We'll manage," Clara said. He looked at the boys, then at her. "You sure about that?" "Papa," Danny said, sounding offended. "He means Hector," Caleb said knowingly. "Hector got into the kitchen once and ate half a pie." "He did not eat half a pie," Eli said. "He ate more than half." Eli set down his cup. He looked at Clara with an expression of genuine apology. "The goat is penned. I fixed the latch last night." "I'm not afraid of goats," Clara said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, but she caught it because she was looking, and she wished immediately that she hadn't been. He put his hat on and walked out. The screen door swung shut behind him, and the sound of his boots crossed the porch and faded, and the kitchen settled into the quiet of a summer morning, with two 7-year-olds staring at a woman they had known for less than 18 hours. "You make good biscuits," Caleb said. "Thank you. Mama used to put honey on top." The kitchen went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of before, but the particular, weighted silence that descended whenever something true and painful was said out loud by someone too young to know it needed cushioning. Clara reached into the cabinet. She found the honey jar on the second shelf, right where she had suspected it might be, and she set it in the center of the table without a word. Danny looked at the jar for a long moment. Then he looked up at her with his father's gray eyes, and he said, very quietly, "Thank you, ma'am." "You're welcome," she said, and she turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. That was the first mini-climax of the day. It would not be the last. By mid-morning, she had learned several important things about the Calloway boys. Danny was the thinker. He watched before he moved, measured before he spoke, and felt things deeply and quietly in the way of people who had learned early that showing emotion was a complicated business. He was exactly like his father in this, and it made her chest ache in a way she had not anticipated. Caleb was the talker. He narrated his own life as he lived it, a running commentary on everything he touched and thought and noticed, and he had opinions, strong, fully formed, surprisingly well-reasoned opinions, about subjects ranging from the correct way to stack firewood to whether the territorial government was doing right by the cattle ranchers, a topic he had apparently absorbed wholesale from overheard adult conversations. She was teaching Caleb his multiplication tables at the kitchen table when he stopped mid-problem and said, "Why did that man leave you at the station?" Clara's pencil stopped moving. Caleb looked at her with the frank, undefended curiosity of a child who had not yet been taught that some questions were invasive. "Everyone in town was talking about it at Briggs's store. Danny heard it and told me." "You shouldn't repeat things you overhear," Clara said evenly. "I know, but I already repeated it so." He watched her. "Was it because he didn't love you anymore?" She set the pencil down. She looked at this boy with his summer-brown face and his missing tooth and his total absence of cruelty. He wasn't trying to wound her. She understood that. He was trying to understand something about the world, the way children did, using whatever materials were available. "I think," she said carefully, "that he had never loved me the way I deserved. And it took me a while to figure that out." Caleb considered this with genuine seriousness. "That's sad," he said. "Yes." "Are you still sad about it?" She looked at him. "A little," she said, "but less than yesterday." He nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer, the kind that confirmed some internal calculation he'd been working through. Then he picked up his pencil. 6 times 7, he said. "You tell me," Clara said. He screwed up his face. 42? "That's right." He looked unreasonably pleased with himself. She picked up her pencil, and somehow, she couldn't have explained precisely how, the question and its answer, and the small, honest exchange between them, had shifted something in the air of that kitchen, lightened it. The way a window opened on a close summer day could change the whole quality of a room. Ruth Calloway arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, like a small weather event. She was Eli's younger sister by 7 years, with the same gray eyes and a completely different relationship to silence, meaning she had none. She came through the front door, talking, and she had not stopped when Clara came in from the back porch to find her standing in the middle of the kitchen, arms folded, studying Clara with an expression that was warm and sharp in equal measure. "You're the woman Thomas Hale stranded," Ruth said. "Good afternoon," Clara said. "Lord, he is a terrible man. My brother wanted to go after him at the station, but I told him a man that low wasn't worth the effort." She unfolded her arms and stuck out her hand. "Ruth Calloway, you're braver than you look coming out here. No offense." "Some taken," Clara said, but she shook the hand. "Clara Merritt." Ruth looked at the kitchen, the swept floor, the dishes stacked clean, the bread rising on the counter. She looked at both boys, who were outside, visible through the window, engaged in some game that appeared to involve throwing things at a fence post and arguing about the results. "My brother said you were capable," Ruth said. "He undersold it. He said about 12 words to me in total. That's 12 more than he says to most people." Ruth sat down at the table with the ease of a woman who had sat at this table 10,000 times. "He hasn't had help in 2 months, since Marta left." "Why did she leave?" Ruth looked at her steadily. Something calculated itself behind those gray eyes. "Because Eli wouldn't ask her to stay," she said, and she had been waiting for him to ask. The implication settled over Clara like a second skin she hadn't asked to put on. "I'm here for 6 weeks," Clara said clearly, "until the school term starts." "I know," Ruth said. "He knows too." "Then we understand each other." Ruth tilted her head and smiled, and it was a smile that said she understood considerably more than Clara had said, and had the grace not to press it. "Do you play cards?" she asked instead. "Reasonably well." "Good. I've been winning every hand for 3 years because Eli folds on anything above a pair. It's embarrassing for both of us." The afternoon passed easily, and Clara found herself grateful for Ruth in the uncomplicated way she was grateful for strong coffee and level ground. Simple necessities that made everything else more bearable. Ruth was funny and direct and loved her brother with a fierceness she didn't bother to conceal. And she loved those boys with the same fierceness. And when she told Clara stories about Eli, his stubbornness, his terrible cooking, the time he tried to fix the roof himself and ended up with his boot through the ceiling, Clara laughed, genuinely and without calculation, for the first time since she had packed her trunk in Missouri and told herself she was heading towards something better. It felt strange, that laugh, like a muscle she had forgotten she had. She was still thinking about it when Eli came back in from the range. He came through the door with trail dust on his coat, and both boys hit him at the knees the moment he stepped over the threshold, one on each side, and he absorbed the impact without breaking stride, which Clara gathered was standard procedure. He ruffled their hair with both hands simultaneously, and said something quietly that made Caleb bark a laugh and Danny grin. And then he looked up and saw her and Ruth sitting at the kitchen table with the card game between them, and he stopped. "You two introduced yourselves," he said. It was not a question. "She's better at cards than you are," Ruth said. "Most people are." He set his hat on the peg by the door. He looked at Clara, and there was something different in his expression now than there had been this morning. Some small, cautious softening. "Supper ready?" 20 minutes, Clara said. He nodded. He disappeared toward the back of the house, and Ruth looked at Clara across the card table with an expression she was not even trying to hide. "Don't," Clara said. "I didn't say a word," Ruth said serenely, and laid down a queen. Supper that night was the loudest meal Clara had sat through in years, and she had taught school. Caleb had a story about the fence post game that required 3 dramatic reenactments. Danny corrected his brother's account at least 4 times with what appeared to be clinical precision. Ruth argued both sides simultaneously, apparently for sport. Eli said almost nothing, but ate 2 helpings and watched his family the way a man watched something he was afraid to love too openly, in case loving it too openly made it fragile. Clara noticed this about him over the biscuits and the beans and the corn she had found at the bottom of the vegetable crate. The way his eyes moved to his boys when they weren't looking at him. The way he shifted his chair an inch closer to Caleb when Caleb got particularly animated. Just that inch, a purely reflexive gesture of proximity and protection that he didn't appear to know he was making. She looked away. She buttered her bread. After Ruth left and the boys were in bed, Clara was washing dishes when Eli came back into the kitchen. He picked up a dish towel without asking and started drying, and they stood side by side at the basin in the cooling evening and worked without speaking, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. That surprised her more than any of it. "Ruth likes you," he said finally. "I like her. She doesn't like most people. She's discerning. I respect that." He set a plate in the cabinet. He looked sideways at her. "The boys were different today." "Different how?" "Calmer." He paused. "Caleb hasn't talked about the multiplication table since 2nd grade. He came and told me he knew up to his 7s now." "He's smart. He just needed someone to give him a reason to care about it." Eli was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something again, the way she had at the table that first afternoon, working through it methodically, the way a man worked through any problem that mattered. "Danny asked me tonight," he said slowly, "if you were going to stay." Clara's hands went still in the water. "He knows I'm here for the summer," she said carefully. "I told him that." Another pause. He said, "But what if she wanted to stay longer? Would you let her?" She did not look at him. "What did you tell him?" she asked. Eli set the last dish in the cabinet and folded the towel neatly over the oven handle. He stood with his back to the counter and his arms loose at his sides, and when she finally turned to look at him, his expression was not unreadable, just careful. The expression of a man who had stopped making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I told him," he said, "that wasn't the kind of question I could answer for someone else." She held his gaze, held it for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I try to be," he said. She dried her hands. She said good night. She walked down the hall to her small room and shut the door quietly behind her, and she stood with her back against it in the dark and waited for her heartbeat to settle into something normal. It took longer than she expected. Considerably longer. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when she heard it, a sound outside her window, soft and rhythmic, and then a voice she recognized immediately. She pulled her robe around her and went to the window. Danny was sitting on the back porch steps, with his knees pulled up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them. And he was very still, in the way children were still when they were trying not to be noticed. The summer night was warm and full of crickets, and the boy was small against all of it. The kind of small that made the chest ache. Clara opened the back door quietly. He startled. He looked up at her, and in the moonlight she could see that his face was tracked with tears that he had already stopped allowing himself to shed, which was somehow worse than if he'd still been crying. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said. His voice was carefully controlled. 7 years old, and already he had learned that voice. "You didn't," she said. She sat down on the step beside him, not too close. "Can't sleep?" He was quiet for a long time. The crickets filled the space. "I dreamed about Mama," he said finally. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say it would be all right. She sat beside him and let the night exist between them and waited. "In the dream, she was at the table," he said, "like she was supposed to be there. And then I woke up and she wasn't." He pressed his chin against his knees. "She never is." "No," Clara said quietly. "She isn't." He looked at her sideways. "Does it stop, dreaming about them?" She thought about her husband, about the dreams she'd had in the first year after, the ones where she turned and he was right there, and then woke to the particular cruelty of remembering. "Not completely," she said honestly. "But the dreams change. After a while, they're not as much about the missing, they're more about the remembering. And that feels different." He was quiet. He seemed to be turning this over. "Better or worse?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Much better." He laid his cheek against his knees and looked out at the dark pasture. She sat beside him and didn't touch him and didn't push, and let him be whoever he needed to be at 10 o'clock on a summer night in Arizona, with his grief and his questions and his father's careful gray eyes. After a while, he said, "I'm glad you're here, Miss Merritt." Something broke open in her chest, quietly, like a fist slowly unclenching. "I'm glad too," she said. She sat with him until his eyes grew heavy, and then she walked him back inside to his bed and tucked the sheet around him, the way she had tucked in her students' lost buttons and untied shoelaces. Practically, briskly, with nothing sentimental in it. She was almost to the door when he said, half asleep, "Miss Merritt?" "Hmm?" "You said the dreams change." A long, drowsy pause. "Does that mean you still dream about him? Your husband?" She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "Sometimes," she said softly. "Is that sad?" "No," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "Not anymore." She pulled the door most of the way closed and stood in the hall for a long moment in the dark. And she thought about Thomas Hale on that train. And she thought about the ring she had slid back into her bag. And she thought about Danny Calloway's question, and the answer she had given him, and the strange, unexpected truth of it. Not sad anymore. She walked back to her room. Outside, the summer night stretched on, wide and indifferent and enormous. And somewhere in the house, Eli Calloway was still awake. She could hear the faint sound of him in the front room, the occasional creak of a floorboard, the small sounds of a man who was the last one up, because some part of him could not fully rest until everyone under his roof was accounted for. She listened to those sounds for a while before she closed her eyes, and when she slept, she did not dream about Thomas Hale at all. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week. The rhythm of the ranch settled around Clara the way rhythms did when they were right, not through force or decision, but through the slow accumulation of small daily acts that began to feel like her own. She learned how Caleb liked his eggs and how Danny drank his milk only if it was cold. She learned that Eli was up at 4:30 without exception, and that he drank 2 cups of coffee before he said much of anything, and that this was not antisocial behavior, but simply the way the man's mind needed the morning to go. She learned where the spare axle grease was kept, and which hinge on the back gate squeaked, and that Hector the goat did, in fact, have a persistent interest in getting into the kitchen, and that the fixed latch was, in Eli's words, a temporary solution to a permanent problem. She was learning the shape of this place. She did not examine that too closely. What she did examine carefully, and with the practical turn of mind she had relied on most of her life, was the thing she had seen at the Briggs store on Thursday morning. She had gone in for salt and flour, and she had stood at the counter waiting while Harold Briggs finished a conversation with two men she didn't recognize. She had not meant to listen, but the store was small, and the men were not quiet. "Bank's patience isn't unlimited," one of the men said. 6 months behind is 6 months behind. "Calloway's land is worth 3 times what he owes," Briggs said. "The question is whether he'll see reason before we have to pursue other options." "He won't sell." "No, but he might not have a choice." Briggs's voice dropped slightly. "A man with 2 boys and no wife and a ranch running short-handed doesn't have much leverage. Not when the bank comes calling." Clara had picked up her flour and her salt and walked out without buying anything else. She had not said a word about it to Eli. Not yet. But she thought about it while she made supper that evening, while she watched him sit at the table with his ranch ledger open and his brow furrowed, and his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was looking at numbers that weren't adding up. She thought about Briggs's voice, the patience of it, the certainty. She set the pot on the table and looked at the top of Eli Calloway's bent head and felt something move through her that was not sympathy, or not only sympathy. It was something sharper and more purposeful than that. She had not come to this town expecting any of this. She had not come expecting a ranch, or 2 boys, or a man who dried dishes in silence and sat up late because he needed to know his household was safe. But she was here. And she was not, Clara Merritt had never once in her life been, the kind of woman who looked at trouble coming and turned the other direction. She sat down across from him. "Eli," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "Tell me about the bank," she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard since the 9 o'clock train pulled out of Coldwater Creek Station and took her future with it. Eli did not answer right away. He closed the ledger. He set both hands flat on the cover of it, the way a man set his hands on something he was trying to keep from getting away from him. And he looked at Clara across the table, with an expression that moved through several things before it settled on something that was very close to resignation. "Who told you?" he said, not angry, just tired. "I heard Briggs talking at the store," she said. "I wasn't trying to listen." "But you did." "I did." She kept her voice even. 6 months behind. That's what he said. Eli pushed back from the table. He stood and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her. And she waited, the way she had learned to wait with him, without pressure, without filling the silence, just being present in it until he was ready to move. "Sarah got sick in November," he said finally. "Before she... It went on for 4 months. Doctors cost money. Medicine costs money." He paused. "Then the winter took 12 head of cattle. Then the spring rains washed out the north fence line, and I had to rebuild 1/2 mile of it." Another pause. Longer. "I got behind. I went to the bank. Briggs sits on the board. And Briggs wants the land." He turned from the window. He looked at her directly, and the look was hard and clear and without self-pity. But underneath it was something that had been carrying too much weight for too long. "He's been wanting it for 2 years," Eli said, "since before Sarah died. He made me an offer the year before she got sick. I turned him down. He said..." His jaw tightened. "He said I'd come around eventually, that a man running a ranch alone always did." "He was counting on it," Clara said. "He was planning for it." The distinction in Eli's voice was sharp and deliberate. "There's a difference." Clara folded her hands on the table. She thought about Briggs' patient voice, the certainty in it, the way he had mentioned the school position and the ranch in the same breath. as if he had calculated the whole thing, the whole chain of it, and found it satisfactory. "How much do you owe?" she asked. He told her. She did not flinch, though the number was significant. "And the land is worth 3 times that," she said. "More." Something flickered in his expression. "It's good land, Clara. It was my father's land. His father's before that." He stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she thought perhaps he hadn't noticed. And she thought perhaps he had. "I'm not selling it." "I'm not suggesting you should," she said. He studied her. "Then what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that you need a plan that isn't just hoping the cattle prices hold and the next fence line doesn't wash out." She met his gaze. "And I'm suggesting that Briggs is going to push harder before the summer's out, and you should not be surprised when he does." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled his chair back out and sat down across from her, and he looked at her with something in his face she hadn't seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that having someone simply acknowledge the weight of it felt like putting down half the load. "You figured all that out from one overheard conversation?" he said. "I was a bookkeeper for 3 years before I went back to teaching," she said. "Men like Briggs have a pattern. I've seen it before." "In Missouri?" "In Missouri." She looked at him steadily. "My husband was not a careful man with money. I learned to read the signs." Something shifted in his face at that, careful and quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. "That must have been hard." "It was educational," she said. And before he could say anything to that, she added, "Let me look at the ledger." He stared at her. "The ledger," she said again. "Let me look at the numbers. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and I know how to read a financial record." He did not hand it over immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, measuring something, she thought, that had less to do with the ledger and more to do with how much he was willing to trust someone who had been in his house for 7 days. Then he slid it across the table. She opened it. She read. She was still reading an hour later when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, hair on end, announcing that Danny had fallen out of bed and wouldn't stop crying but was probably fine. Eli was up before Clara had even moved. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs. Fast, but not panicked. The stride of a man who knew the difference between actually hurt and upset and embarrassed. And then she heard Danny's voice, muffled, and Eli's lower voice answering. And after a few minutes, the crying stopped, and the footsteps came back down. Caleb was still standing in the doorway. He looked at the open ledger on the table. He looked at Clara. "Are you fixing it?" he asked. Clara looked up. "Fixing what?" "The money problem." He said it with complete matter-of-factness, the way children said the things adults thought they hadn't heard. "Papa stays up late looking at that book. He thinks we're asleep, but we're not." Clara held this boy's gaze for a moment. 7 years old, lying in his bed at night, listening to his father worry, and filing it away behind those bright, dark eyes, because he didn't know what else to do with it. "I'm helping your papa look at it," she said. "That's all." "But you're smart," Caleb said, as if this settled the matter entirely. "Go back to bed, Caleb." "Yes, ma'am." He disappeared. She heard his feet on the stairs, and then nothing. When Eli came back down, she had found 3 places in the ledger where the numbers could be restructured, and 1 significant entry that did not add up. She pointed to it without preamble. "This payment to Briggs's supply company. It's twice what the same order cost in January." Eli sat down. He leaned over and looked at where she was pointing. His expression went very still. "He handles the supply contracts for half the ranches in the county," he said slowly. and charges whatever he likes because no one's comparing the numbers side by side. She looked at him. Has anyone else complained? Not to me. His jaw was tight. But I haven't asked. You should ask. She turned the ledger so he could see it better. If he's overcharging across the board, that's not a business practice. That's extortion. And the territorial court would take an interest in that. Eli looked at the numbers. He looked at her, and something moved through his expression that was not quite anger and not quite hope, but had the quality of both. The particular look of a man who had thought he was cornered, discovering that the walls were not, in fact, as solid as they'd appeared. You got all that, he said quietly, in 1 hour. I told you, I know how to read a ledger. He was silent for a moment. Then he reached out and turned the ledger back and looked at the entry again, and she watched the calculation moving behind his eyes. The same methodical, thorough quality of thought she had watched him apply to every problem she'd seen him face. I need to talk to Pete Harlow, he said. He runs the double bar spread 10 miles east. If Briggs has been doing the same to him, then you have more than a complaint, Clara said. You have a case. He looked at her, straight and direct, and with a weight behind it that she felt across the table. Clara, he said, why are you doing this? The question landed quietly. She considered it honestly. Because someone should, she said. And because Briggs sat across his desk from me and offered me a job in the same breath he was discussing how to take your land. And I found that, she paused, I found that personally offensive. Something broke loose in Eli's expression. Not the almost smile from before. This was fuller than that, real and unguarded. And it lasted only a moment before he pulled it back. But she had seen it, and it sat in her chest, warm and inconvenient, and entirely unwelcome. I'll ride out to Pete's tomorrow, he said. Good, she said. She closed the ledger. She stood. She said goodnight for the second time in 8 days and walked down the hall to her room. And this time she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in the lamplight and told herself with great firmness that she was here for 6 weeks, and that was the end of it. 6 weeks, then September, then the schoolhouse. Her heart did not particularly care about any of this reasoning, which she found irritating. Ruth showed up the next morning before Eli had even left for Pete Harlow's place, and she took one look at the kitchen table and the chairs pushed close together and the ledger still sitting out, and she looked at Clara with an expression of theatrical innocence that did not fool anyone. Bookkeeping, Clara said flatly, before Ruth could open her mouth. I didn't say a word. You were about to. I was going to ask about the biscuits, Ruth said, sitting down. They smell wonderful. She folded her hands on the table. And then I was going to say something about bookkeeping. Then we can skip directly to, nothing happened and I don't want to hear about it. Ruth looked at her with those gray eyes that were so like Eli's and so completely unlike Eli's at the same time. Clara, when is the last time my brother pushed that ledger across to another human being? Clara said nothing. Exactly, Ruth said. Eli came through then with his hat on and both boys behind him clamoring about coming along to Pete Harlow's, and he said no twice and yes once to some modification they proposed. And then he looked at Clara in the kitchen doorway and said, I'll be back by 3. Ruth will stay. I know, Clara said. He held her gaze for one beat that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he put his hat on and walked out. Ruth watched all of this with the focused attention of a woman at a very good theater performance. Nothing happened, Clara said again. Said Ruth, and poured herself coffee. What happened at 2:30 that afternoon was not nothing. Clara was in the yard hanging wash when she heard the horse. She knew before she turned that it wasn't Eli. The pace was wrong, too fast and too deliberate. The stride of a man arriving with purpose rather than returning home. Harold Briggs dismounted at the gate. He was not alone. He had two men with him she recognized from the store, and he was carrying a leather satchel, and he had the look of a man who had decided the time for patience was over. Clara set down the sheet she was holding. "Mr. Briggs," she said. He stopped at the sight of her. Something recalculated behind his small eyes. "Miss Merritt, is Calloway here?" "He's not." "When do you expect him?" "I couldn't say," she said pleasantly. Briggs studied her. The two men behind him stayed near their horses, and she understood the geometry of this. 3 men, 1 woman, a yard with no one else in it. She understood it, and she did not let it move her face 1 fraction of an inch. "I have papers for him," Briggs said, "from the bank." "Then you can leave them," Clara said, "and he'll read them when he gets home." "I'd prefer to deliver them personally." "I'm sure you would." She kept her voice light and her feet planted. "But Mr. Calloway isn't here, and I'm not going to stand here and be your substitute audience while you remind me what's in papers that aren't addressed to me." Briggs' jaw shifted. "You've got a quick tongue for a woman in your position." "And what position is that?" She tilted her head. "Employed? Housed? Considerably less desperate than you seem to have been counting on?" The two men near the horses exchanged a look. Briggs did not. He reached into the satchel and held out a sealed envelope. She walked to the gate and took it from him, without breaking his gaze. And she held it at her side and waited. "You tell Calloway," Briggs said quietly, "that the bank needs an answer by the end of the month. The 15th. That's 3 weeks. I'll tell him." "And you tell him," he paused. Something in his expression went flat and deliberate. "You tell him that the offer for the land still stands. Full value. He'd walk away clean." "I'll tell him that too," Clara said. "And I'll let him decide what to do with it, because it's his land and his decision, not yours." Something moved through Briggs's expression that she did not like. Not anger, but something colder than anger. Assessment. "You're teaching school in September," he said. "I want you to remember that the school board has final say on appointments." There it was. The silence that followed was exactly as long as it needed to be. "Are you threatening my position, Mr. Briggs?" "I'm reminding you of how things work in Coldwater Creek." He touched the brim of his hat in a parody of courtesy. "Good afternoon, Miss Merritt." He turned his horse and the two men followed, and Clara stood at the gate and watched them ride back down the road until they were nothing but dust. Then she let out a slow breath. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. She went inside. She found Ruth standing in the kitchen doorway with both boys behind her, all 3 of them having watched the entire exchange through the front window. "He threatened your school position," Ruth said. Her voice was very controlled. "He tried to," Clara said. "What are you going to do?" Clara set the envelope on the table. She looked at it for a moment, at Eli's name written on the front in a clerk's careful hand. "Right now," she said, "I'm going to finish hanging the wash. And when Eli gets home, we're going to figure this out together." Caleb stepped out from behind Ruth. "You didn't back down," he said, with an expression that landed somewhere between impressed and awed. "No," Clara said, "I did not." "Papa doesn't back down either," Danny said quietly from beside his brother. She looked at both of them, at those 2 small faces watching her with something she recognized, the particular look of children who needed to see that the adults around them were not going to fold. "Good," she said. "Then we're all on the same page." Eli was back before 3, and Ruth met him at the door before he had his hat off. He read the envelope standing up. She watched his face, the stillness of it, The way the muscle in his jaw worked. The single, careful breath he took before he folded the letter and set it on the table. Then she told him about Briggs, about the school position. He looked at her when she finished, and his face was not what she'd expected. Not rage, something more dangerous than rage. The cold, clear look of a man who had reached the end of what he was willing to accept and had found, on the other side of that line, a perfect and absolute certainty. "He said that to you," he said, very quiet. "He stood in my yard and threatened your position." "He did." "While you were alone." Ruth and the boys were inside. "Clara." He said her name the way he'd said it last night. Not a habit yet, but becoming one. "He came here knowing I wasn't home." "I know." That was deliberate. "Yes," she said. "I know that too." He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at Ruth. Some wordless exchange passed between them, the kind that happened between siblings who had been reading each other their whole lives. "Pete Harlow had the same supply overcharges," Eli said, "every quarter for 2 years. He thought it was just how prices ran." A pause. "He didn't know to compare." "Neither did I." Ruth's eyes went to Clara. "There are 4 other ranches in the county on Briggs's supply contracts," Eli continued. "If even half of them show the same pattern, then you have enough to take to the territorial court," Clara said. "Yes." He picked up the letter again. He looked at it. "He gave me 3 weeks. Then we have 3 weeks." He set the letter down and looked at her, and the look was long and direct, and had in it something she had not seen from him before. Not just the careful assessment she had grown accustomed to, not just the quiet recognition. This was something fuller. Something that acknowledged her in a way that had nothing to do with biscuits or ledgers or summer employment. Something that had everything to do with the two of them standing on the same side of a problem and neither of them flinching. "You should know," he said, very carefully, "that if you help me fight this, Briggs will make it harder for you. Not just the school position. He can make it difficult for you in this town generally." "I grew up in a town run by men like Harold Briggs," Clara said. "I know what that looks like." "And?" "And I'm still standing in your kitchen," she said. "So." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was clearly trying to be. Both boys, hovering at the kitchen doorway, because neither of them had actually gone back to whatever they were supposed to be doing, looked between the adults with wide eyes. Eli held Clara's gaze for a moment that stretched just past comfortable and into something else. Something that neither of them named, and neither of them looked away from. Not quite yet. Then Danny's voice cut through the kitchen with the timing only a child could manage. "Does this mean we're going to beat Mr. Briggs?" he asked. "Danny," Eli said. "Because Caleb bet me 2 marbles we would, and I want to know if I'm going to win." "Caleb," Eli said, with considerably more weight. Caleb looked entirely unrepentant. "I like Miss Merritt's odds," he said. Clara turned to the stove before any of them could see her face. She picked up the pot. She kept her voice absolutely steady. "Supper," she said. 15 minutes. And if she was smiling, and she couldn't help it. She was smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in longer than she could calculate. She kept it between herself and the stove, where it belonged. But she heard Eli move behind her. She heard him cross the kitchen toward the door, and as he passed, she heard him say quietly, just at the edge of being meant only for her, "I'm glad you were at that station, Clara Merritt." He did not wait for an answer. The screen door swung shut behind him. She stood at the stove with the pot in her hands, and the summer evening pressing in through the open window, and 2 boys arguing about marbles in the next room, and she thought, 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to help this man save what was his. And God help Harold Briggs if he thought a woman who had survived Thomas Hale and a train platform and $4.62 was going to let him win. The next 10 days moved like a river with a current under it, calm on the surface, fast and purposeful beneath. Eli rode out to 3 ranches in the first week. He came back each evening quieter than he'd left, and Clara learned to read the particular quality of his silences. There was the silence of a man processing good news slowly, and the silence of a man trying to contain something that wanted to come out as anger. And they were not the same silence. The 3rd evening he came home. He sat down at the kitchen table and said, 5 ranches, all of them overcharged, some of them for 3 years. Clara set a cup in front of him. All willing to go to the territorial court? 4 of them. His jaw was tight. Pete Harlow, the Millers, Frank Dodd, and a man named Calhoun who runs sheep up near the ridge and has apparently been waiting for someone to start this conversation for 2 years. And the 5th? Eli looked at his coffee. Ed Weston. He said he didn't want trouble. He's afraid of Briggs. He's got reason to be. Briggs holds the note on his barn. He exhaled slowly. I'm not going to push a man to sign his name to something when he's got that kind of leverage over him. Clara thought about this. What does the territorial court need? Documented overcharges, signed affidavits from each rancher, and a lawyer. He paused. There's a man in Tucson, James Whitfield. Ruth knows his family. He handles land disputes. Have you written to him? Wrote the letter this afternoon. He looked up at her. It'll take a week to reach him, and another week to hear back. We have a week left on Briggs's deadline. She looked at him steadily. Then we write a second letter. To who? To the bank itself, she said. Not to Briggs, to the bank's board of directors in Tucson. You explain that you are in the process of pursuing legal action against a member of their board for fraudulent business practices, and that you expect this matter will significantly affect his standing. You request a 30-day extension on the basis that your financial situation is materially impacted by his overcharging. Eli stared at her. You go over Briggs's head, she said simply. You make the bank's board aware that one of their members has a conflict of interest in collecting your debt. They won't want that exposure. Banks don't like exposure. The silence stretched across the table between them. Clara, he said slowly, where did you learn to think like this? I was married to a man who was terrible with money, and I spent 8 years fixing what he broke before and after he died, she said. You learn. Something in his expression moved, the careful, guarded quality of it shifting into something that was harder to look at directly, because it was too open. He looked at her the way she had caught him looking at his boys when they weren't watching, with a fullness that he did not allow himself to show when he thought someone could see it. She looked at. They sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, and the letters they wrote were precise and careful, and considerably more dangerous to Harold Briggs than anything he had sent to them. And when they were done, Eli read back through both of them twice, and then set them side by side, and looked at them with the expression of a man who had been playing defense for so long he'd almost forgotten he had legs to run with. You're sure about the wording on the second letter? He asked. The phrase conflict of interest is specific legal language, Clara said. It signals to the board that you know exactly what you're talking about. It's not aggressive. It's precise. He looked at her. There's a difference? Aggressive can be dismissed, she said. Precise cannot. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the pen and signed both letters without changing a word. She folded them. She addressed the envelopes in her clean, school-teacher hand. She set them by the door to go out on the morning post. And then they sat there for a moment, the two of them, in the quiet of a house where everyone else was sleeping, with the summer night pressing in through the window and the lamplight between them, and neither of them said anything. "My wife would have liked you," Eli said finally, very quiet. Clara did not look away. She did not make it small or deflect it. "Tell me about her," she said. He was still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man deciding how much of himself to hand over. Then he said, "She was stubborn, funnier than she had any right to be. She could read a room full of people and know exactly what everyone in it needed before they'd said a word." A pause. "She held this family together with both hands, right up until she couldn't anymore. And then she apologized to me for it." His voice did not break, but it got very careful at the edges. She apologized for dying. Clara pressed her lips together. "She sounds extraordinary," she said. She was. He looked at his hands on the table. "The boys don't talk about her much. Danny does sometimes, at night. But Caleb, he holds it differently. Quieter. And I don't always know how to help him with it because I hold it the same way. And I don't know what to do with mine, either." Clara thought about Caleb at the kitchen table, saying 6 times 7. Thought about the honey jar. About the way he had looked at her after Briggs left the yard. I like Miss Merritt's odds. With that bright, brave bravado of a boy who needed to believe the adults around him were winning. "He's watching you," she said. "He needs to see that you're going to be all right. That's why he puts on the brave face." Eli looked up at her. "He learned it from you," she said gently. "He doesn't know what to do with grief that isn't useful, so he turns it into something he can act on. Same as you." She paused. "You should tell him it's all right to be sad, even when it isn't useful. He needs to hear that from you specifically." Eli was very still. "I'm not criticizing you," she said quickly. "I know you're not." He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression again. "I know." She stood. She pushed her chair in. She needed to be standing for whatever the next few seconds were, she had decided, because she did not trust herself entirely while sitting at a kitchen table, with lamplight, and midnight, and a man who looked at his family like that. "Good night, Eli," she said. "Good night, Clara." He looked up at her from the table, and the look was steady and warm and entirely uncomplicated, which made it the most complicated thing she had encountered in weeks. "Thank you." "For the letters?" "For all of it," he said. She walked down the hall. She did not allow herself to look back. The letter to the bank in Tucson went out Monday morning. By Wednesday, Coldwater Creek knew something was happening. Clara felt it first at May's store. A shift in how people looked at her. A recalibration of the town's collective assessment. She had been the stranded woman, the cautionary tale, the one Thomas Hale had left on the platform. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, that had quietly become something else. She was not sure what, exactly, but she noticed it in the nods she received on the main street, and in the way May herself said, over the counter, "Heard Eli Calloway's been riding around to the other spreads," with a look that asked without asking. "He has," Clara said. "Briggs isn't going to like it." "No," Clara said, "he isn't." May studied her for a long moment. She was not a woman who spent words unnecessarily. "You're good for this town, Clara Merritt," she said finally. "More than you know." Clara took her flower and walked out, and she did not examine what that sentence did to her chest. She found out what Briggs thought of it on Thursday afternoon when she was at the schoolhouse. Briggs had given her the key to begin setting up, which she now understood was partly a calculation that she'd be too occupied and too grateful to cause him trouble. She was organizing the bookshelves when the door opened and Briggs walked in without knocking. "Miss Merritt." He looked around the schoolroom with the proprietary air of a man surveying something he owned. "Getting settled in?" "I am," she said. She did not stop working. She kept her back to him and moved another book into place. "I heard you've been helping Calloway draft correspondence." She turned. She looked at him directly. "I've been doing my job, which includes keeping the household in order." The household. He let the word sit there, the implication unambiguous. "Mr. Briggs," she said evenly, "if you have something to say to me, say it plain." He looked at her. The assessment in his eyes was not friendly. "The bank's board received a letter." "Good." His jaw tightened. "You wrote that letter. Mr. Calloway signed that letter. Don't play word games with me." He stepped further into the room, and she held her ground, because she had learned on the front porch that the day he arrived at the ranch, that moving back was the one thing she would not do. "You're a school teacher. You've been here 3 weeks. This is not your fight." "Mr. Calloway is my employer," she said. "His family is my responsibility. His children are going to be in my classroom in September." She kept her voice clear and perfectly controlled. "Everything that affects them affects my professional concerns. I don't see that as unclear." "The school board meets next week," he said. "Your appointment isn't finalized."
"Then I suppose you should think carefully," she said, "about whether you want the territorial court to know that the head of a school board threatened a teacher's appointment to prevent her from assisting a legal filing against him." She tilted her head. "Because I will put that in a letter too, Mr. Briggs. I will put it in a letter, and I will address it to the Territorial Superintendent of Education. And I will write it in the same precise language I used for the bank. And I promise you, it will not be dismissed." The room was very quiet. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not retreat, not yet, but the first hairline crack of a man realizing the ground he is standing on is not as solid as he had assumed. "You're making an enemy," he said quietly. "You made yourself my enemy," she said, "the day you sat across a desk from me and offered me a job while you were already planning to take that family's land. I don't make enemies, Mr. Briggs. I just don't pretend they're friends." He left without another word. She turned back to the bookshelf. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, she recognized, but from the particular physical aftershock of holding herself completely still under pressure. She gripped the shelf until it passed. Then she put the next book in place. She told Eli that evening. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she reported anything. What had been said, what she had said back, and what she estimated the consequence would be. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a full 10 seconds. "Clara." His voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger, not worry. Something heavier. He could do it. He could block the appointment. "He could try," she said, "but not without cost to himself. He knows that now. If you lose the school position, then I'll find something else." She met his gaze. "I am not going to stand by and let him threaten you and do nothing because I'm worried about my own comfort. That is not how I am built." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know." And somehow those 2 words, said in that voice, with that look, were more than she had received from most people in the last 5 years. And she had to look away before he could see what they did to her. Ruth arrived the next morning with a look on her face that meant she had heard everything, which, in a town the size of Coldwater Creek, meant she had heard everything. "You told Briggs off in the schoolhouse," Ruth said without preamble, sitting down. "I stated my position clearly," Clara said. "Clara?" He turned gray. Ed Weston was outside the window and said he could hear the whole thing. Ruth's eyes were bright. "Half the town is talking about it." "That's not helpful." "No, but it's satisfying."
Ruth folded her hands. Mrs. Patterson, you haven't met her. She runs the women's auxiliary. She came to find me this morning. She said if Briggs tries to block your appointment, the auxiliary will petition the school board directly. She said, and I am quoting exactly, "That woman has more spine than any man in this county, and our children could do worse than learn from her example." Clara stared at her. You have allies, Ruth said simply. You've had them longer than you know. This town has been waiting for someone to stand up to Harold Briggs for years. They just needed to see someone do it first. Clara sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about May's counter, and the nod she'd received on the street, and the shift she had felt, but not understood. And she realized Ruth was right. She had been reading the town incorrectly. She had seen herself as an outsider looking in, and somewhere in the last 3 weeks, the town had been quietly deciding something else about her. I didn't come here to start a fight, she said. I know. Ruth looked at her steadily. But sometimes a fight comes to find you, and the question is just what you do with it. The letter from James Whitfield, the Tucson lawyer, arrived on Friday. Eli read it at the kitchen table. Both boys were at school. The summer term Briggs ran for the younger children, which Clara found bitterly ironic. And Ruth had gone home, and it was just the two of them in the quiet of the midday house, with the summer heat pressing in from outside. He read it twice. He set it down. He'll take the case, he said. Clara exhaled. What does he need? The ledger documentation, signed affidavits from all 4 ranchers. And he says, Eli paused. He picked up the letter again. He read the relevant passage carefully, as if wanting to be sure of the words. He says that if the bank received our letter, they are legally obligated to investigate Briggs's conduct before proceeding with any foreclosure action. He says the deadline is effectively suspended pending that investigation. She looked at him. Eli, it worked, he said, very quiet, as if he was still deciding whether to believe it. The letter to the bank, it suspended the deadline. Briggs can't move on the land while the bank is investigating him, she said. No. He set the letter down carefully. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she felt in her sternum, raw and grateful and entirely unguarded in the way of a man who had run out of the energy required to keep things defended. You bought us time. Whitfield bought you time, she said. I just knew which door to knock on. Clara. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and stood close enough that she had to tilt her chin to look at him. And she did look at him, because looking away felt like a cowardice she wasn't willing to perform. Thank you is not sufficient, he said. I want you to know I understand that. You don't owe me anything, she said. I don't agree with that, he said. The kitchen was very still. The summer light came through the window and lay between them on the floor, and she could hear her own heartbeat in a way she found entirely inconvenient. The affidavits, she said. You should ride out to Pete Harlow today. Get them started. He did not move immediately. He looked at her for one moment that was slightly too long to be accidental, and slightly too brief to demand anything of either of them. And then he stepped back. I'll go this afternoon, he said. Good, she said. He picked up his hat. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, September's closer than it feels. She understood what he wasn't saying. I know, she said quietly. He walked out. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his horse leave the yard, and told herself with great and practiced firmness that she was not going to think about September right now. She was going to think about affidavits and Whitfield and the 4 ranchers and the case. and she was going to do what she had always done, which was take the next practical step, and then the one after that. She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at the empty doorway. The next practical step had been perfectly clear to her every day for 3 weeks. The one after that, the one that lived past September, past the schoolhouse, past the tidy and reasonable life she had been rebuilding in her mind. That step was less clear. And it was getting less clear by the day. And she was running out of ways not to look at it directly. She picked up the letter. She folded it carefully and put it with the ledger. She started on lunch. And in the quiet of the kitchen, with the summer pressing in, and Eli's horse long gone down the road, and the house full of nothing but the small sounds of the life she had walked into on a bad day with $4.62, Clara Merritt admitted to herself, quietly, without drama, with the plain practicality that was her truest nature, that she did not want to leave. She had not wanted to leave for at least a week and a half. She just had not been willing to say so, not even to herself, until now. She picked up the flour. She started the bread. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, and her mind moved through the unfamiliar territory of a feeling she had not expected, and could no longer argue away. And outside the window, the summer moved through its long, unhurried arc toward the thing that was coming. Saturday morning, everything changed. Clara was in the yard with the boys. Danny working on his letters with the slate board Clara had brought from the schoolhouse. Caleb allegedly doing the same, but actually conducting a trial of some kind involving 3 rocks and a stick, which he had been explaining to Danny for 20 minutes with the gravity of a judge. When Ruth came riding in, fast. Not Ruth's usual pace. Fast. Clara stood up. Ruth dismounted before her horse had fully stopped. Her face was flushed and her jaw was set, and she had the look of a woman carrying news that had weight to it. "What is it?" Clara said. Ruth looked at the boys. "Caleb, take your brother inside and get him some water." "But now, Caleb." Something in her aunt's voice moved them without further argument. Both boys went inside. The screen door swung shut. Ruth turned to Clara. "Briggs called an emergency school board meeting this morning, at 7 o'clock. I heard about it an hour ago from May." Clara's stomach dropped an inch. "And?" "They voted." Ruth looked at her steadily. "Your appointment was revoked." The word landed in Clara's chest like a stone into still water. "On what grounds?" she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "Briggs cited conduct unbecoming a public educator," Ruth said. The contempt in her voice was very controlled. "He said you had inappropriately inserted yourself into private business disputes and created discord in the community." She paused. "He had it done before anyone could petition against it. 7 in the morning, Saturday. 3 board members who owe him favors." Clara looked at the ground. She thought about the schoolhouse, about the books she had organized and the slates she had counted, and the names she had already been turning over in her mind. The children who had walked through that door in September, including the 2 currently inside this house. She thought about what she had said to Briggs. "I will put it in a letter." She had underestimated his speed. "Does Eli know?" she said. "I came here first." Clara looked at the house. She thought about walking inside and telling those 2 boys that she would not be their teacher in September. She thought about Eli's face. She thought about Thomas Hale walking onto that train. And something moved through her. Not the grief of the platform, not the desperate, hollow shock of being abandoned. Something else. Something that started at the base of her spine and moved up through her chest and settled behind her eyes with a clarity she had not felt in years. She was not going to fold. Where does Whitfield stand on using the school board action as additional evidence of Briggs's pattern of retaliation? She asked. Ruth blinked. Then a slow, fierce smile spread across her face. I have no idea, she said. But I think you should ask him. I intend to, Clara said. The moment Eli gets back, she turned toward the house. She stopped with her hand on the screen door. Ruth, she said, when did Briggs make me his enemy? The day you didn't back down at that gate, Ruth said without hesitation. Clara nodded once. Good, she said. Then he knows what he's dealing with. She walked inside. The door swung shut behind her. Eli came home at 4 o'clock, and Ruth was still there, and he knew something was wrong before he got through the gate. He read it in the way Clara was standing. Not collapsed, not defeated, but with that particular stillness she carried when she was holding something that had weight to it and refusing to put it down. He had learned to read her the way he had learned to read weather, not through any single signal, but through the sum of small things that added up to a certainty. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the house. He went inside. Clara told him at the kitchen table, the same way she told him everything. Directly, without softening it, with the facts lined up in order. The 7 o'clock meeting, the 3 board members, the phrase, conduct unbecoming a public educator, and the man who had engineered it before anyone could push back. Eli listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 full seconds, and she watched the muscle in his jaw work through the particular sequence it ran, when he was deciding whether to let himself be angry or whether anger was a luxury the situation couldn't afford. He made his decision. Get me the ledger, he said, very quiet. Eli, Clara, he looked at her. Get me the ledger. She got it. He opened it to the page she had marked 3 weeks ago. The double-charged supply entry, the one that had started everything, and he looked at it. And then he looked up at her, and his expression was the clearest she had ever seen it. No ambivalence in it, no calculation weighing the cost. He took your job, he said, because of me. He took my job because he is a small man who runs out of arguments and starts using power, she said. That is not your fault. It is my ranch and my fight, and you walked into the middle of it. I walked into the middle of it myself. I handed you that ledger first. Clara, Eli. She leaned forward. Are we going to spend the next 10 minutes assigning responsibility, or are we going to finish what we started? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite something else, and was perhaps both at once. What did you have in mind? He said. I want to write to Whitfield tonight. Tonight, not tomorrow. The school board action is direct evidence of retaliation. It establishes a pattern of Briggs using institutional positions to punish people who oppose him. That's not separate from the fraud case. It's part of it. She held his gaze. And I want to ride into town Monday morning and walk into that school board office and file a formal complaint with the territorial superintendent myself, on paper, in my name. Ruth, who had been standing in the doorway the whole time, said, I'll come with you. Clara looked at her. Don't argue, Ruth said. I've wanted to do something about that man for 2 years, and you have finally given me a vehicle. Eli looked at his sister. He looked at Clara. He looked at the ledger. Write the letter, he said. I'll get the boys to bed. They wrote until 10 o'clock, and the letter to Whitfield that emerged from that kitchen table was the most precisely constructed thing Clara had ever put her name to. It documented the school board action in full. The emergency timing, the absence of notice, the 3 board members with known financial ties to Briggs, the specific language used to justify the revocation. It connected it explicitly to the supply fraud, to the threatened foreclosure, to the visit Briggs had made to the Calloway yard with 2 men while Eli was away. It named a pattern. It asked Whitfield to consider whether the territorial court's jurisdiction extended to public office corruption alongside private business fraud. When they finished, Eli read it through once, and then he looked at Clara and said, "You should be a lawyer." "I was a school teacher," she said. "Same skill set, different application." He almost laughed. A real laugh, fuller than the almost smiles she'd been collecting for weeks. And it changed his face in a way she was not prepared for, and had to look down at the table to manage. She sealed the envelope. She set it by the door. The house was very quiet. The boys were long asleep, and Ruth had gone home an hour ago. And it was the 2 of them again, in the lamplight, with the summer night outside, and the letter on the table between them, that was either the end of something or the beginning. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "You don't know what I was going to say." "I have a reasonable guess." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, "September." Just the word, just the one. She looked at her hands on the table. "The appointment's been revoked. So September is—" She paused. "Less clear than it was." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" She looked up. He was watching her with that open, undefended expression, the one he only allowed himself when he thought he had already been too obvious to pretend otherwise. "Ask me in 3 weeks," she said, "when this is settled." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing past it, the way he accepted most things, with patience, with the particular faith of a man who had learned that pushing too hard broke what you were trying to hold. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Eli." She walked down the hall. She lay on the narrow mattress in the small room with the window that looked over the back pasture, and she stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time. Monday morning, she and Ruth rode into Coldwater Creek side by side, and they were not quiet about it. Ruth had, apparently, spent the weekend in conversation with Mrs. Patterson of the Women's Auxiliary, and what walked into the Territorial Land Office with Clara that morning was not 2 women with a complaint, but a formal delegation of 7. May, Mrs. Patterson, Ruth, 2 women Clara had met only briefly, and a rancher's wife named Grace Dodd, who said almost nothing, but had a handshake like a vice, and eyes that had clearly seen worse than Harold Briggs. The Territorial Superintendent's office was in the county building, 1 floor above where Briggs kept his own office, which Clara found satisfying in a way she did not examine closely. The man behind the desk was named Carter. He was 50-ish and careful, and had the look of a bureaucrat who had survived several administrations by being genuinely competent, which Clara decided within the first 2 minutes was the best thing she could have hoped for. She laid out the documentation, every piece of it, in order, clearly labeled, with the relevant passages underlined in the precise hand of a woman who had organized classrooms and ledgers and correspondence for 20 years. Carter read for 11 minutes without speaking. The women sat. May looked at her nails. Mrs. Patterson looked at the wall. Ruth looked at Briggs's closed office door 1 floor down, with an expression that needed no translation. Carter set the documents down. He looked at Clara. "Miss Merritt," he said, "when was the school board meeting held?" "Saturday last, 7 in the morning." "Were you notified of the meeting?" "I was not." "Were any parents of enrolled students notified?" "Not to my knowledge." He looked at the emergency meeting notice she had included, obtained from May, who had obtained it from the clerk, who apparently had strong feelings about how Saturday morning meetings were conducted. "Standard protocol requires 48 hours notice and a parent quorum for revocation of a certified appointment," Carter said. "Yes," Clara said. I know. Carter looked at her steadily. The meeting did not meet procedural requirements. No, Clara said. It did not. He picked up his pen. I'm reinstating your appointment pending formal review, he said. And I'm opening an investigation into the conduct of the board chair. He looked up from his paperwork. Do you have documentation on the related financial matter as well? My attorney is James Whitfield of Tucson, Clara said. He has the full case file. Carter wrote down the name. He looked at the delegation of 7 women sitting in his office on a Monday morning, and something crossed his face that was not quite admiration and not quite amusement, but lived comfortably between them. Is there anything else I can do for you ladies today? Not at present, Ruth said, but we'll be back if necessary. I have no doubt, Carter said. They walked out into the Monday morning sun, and Mrs. Patterson took Clara's arm on the boardwalk and said, I want you to know, my daughter has been waiting for a teacher like you her entire school career. And Clara thought she was going to hold herself together just fine, until May reached over from the other side and squeezed her hand once, hard, without a word. And then she had to look up at the sky and breathe carefully for a moment, until the stinging behind her eyes resolved itself. She was not going to cry on the main street of Coldwater Creek. She had standards. She managed. Barely. The twist came on Wednesday, and it came from the direction none of them had expected. Ed Weston rode into the Callaway yard at mid-morning. He was a lean, quiet man, with a weathered face and the careful eyes of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was tired of it. He took his hat off at the gate. He looked at Clara, who had come out to meet him, and then he looked at the house. Is Callaway here? He asked. He's in the barn. I'll get him. Ma'am? He stopped her. He looked at his hat in his hands. I heard about the school board, about what Briggs did. He was quiet for a moment. I've got 3 kids, all of them going into that schoolhouse in September. She waited. I've been afraid of what Briggs would do to my barn note if I signed that affidavit, he said. I want you to know I know that's a cowardly thing. I've known it since the day I said no to Eli. It's not cowardice to protect your family, Clara said. It is when protecting my family means letting that man keep doing what he's doing to other people's families. He straightened. His jaw was set. I want to sign. If Whitfield will still take the affidavit. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He will. Then I'd like to talk to Callaway. She went and got Eli, and she stood in the yard and listened to the 2 men shake hands. And she thought about fear and the moment it broke. The hairline fracture that became a split, that became something irreversible. And she thought about what it cost a person to walk through a gate with their hat in their hands and say, I should have done this sooner. She thought it cost considerably more than most people gave it credit for. She went inside and started coffee. Whitfield arrived in Coldwater Creek on Thursday, one day earlier than expected, which told Clara his read of the situation matched hers. This needed to move before Briggs could regroup. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 35, with quick eyes and the kind of organized mind that expressed itself in precise sentences. He sat at the Callaway kitchen table and read every document she placed in front of him. And when he looked up, he said, This is one of the cleaner cases I've seen in 5 years of territorial practice. Clean meaning, Eli said. Meaning the documentation is clear, the pattern is established, and your complainants are credible. He looked at Clara. Miss Merritt, the school board action is exactly what I needed to establish the retaliation pattern. Without that piece, the fraud case and the foreclosure pressure could be argued as separate incidents. With it, it's a coherent picture of a man who uses every institutional lever available to him to consolidate control. He paused. That is not merely fraud. That is corruption of public office, and the territorial court takes that considerably more seriously.
What does that mean for the timeline? Clara asked.
I'm filing Monday. I'm requesting an immediate injunction against any foreclosure action pending resolution, and I'm asking the court to compel the bank to suspend Briggs's board membership during the investigation. Whitfield folded his hands. If the judge grants the injunction, and I believe he will, Briggs loses his leverage entirely. The bank isn't going to wait for a fraud verdict to distance themselves from him. Banks don't sit still for that kind of exposure. Eli was very quiet. Clara looked at him.
It's not over yet, she said quietly. Just for him.
No, he said. But it looks different than it did a month ago.
Different how? He looked at her with those careful gray eyes, and he said very simply,
like it's going to be all right. She held his gaze. She believed him. The injunction was granted on the following Tuesday. Eli got the telegram at the post office, and he came home with it in his hand, and both boys ran at him at the gate, the way they always did, and he caught them both and lifted them off the ground simultaneously, one under each arm, and they shrieked with delight. And Clara watched from the porch and felt the thing in her chest that she had been trying to name for weeks settle into something she finally recognized. It was home. That was what it was. She had been feeling home for weeks and calling it something else because calling it home was terrifying. And she had been terrified of enough things recently to last her a considerable while. Eli set the boys down. He walked toward the porch. He held up the telegram. "Injunction granted," he said. "Full suspension of foreclosure proceedings. Briggs is suspended from the bank board pending criminal investigation." She sat down on the porch step. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "Good," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He sat down beside her on the step, not across from her, not at a table with the careful width of professional distance between them. Beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the summer air. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "You're about to say something that has September in it." He was quiet for a moment. "September doesn't have to mean what it meant a month ago." She looked at her hands. "My appointment was reinstated." "I know." "The schoolhouse is 3 miles away." "I know that too." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking back at her with the expression she had first caught across a kitchen table at midnight. Open, unguarded, the face of a man who had used up all his defenses on other things and had none left for this. "Eli," she said, "I need you to say it plainly, because I am a practical woman and I do not navigate well by implication." Something broke loose in his face. Almost the laugh. Almost. And then something more serious than the laugh. Warmer than the laugh. "Stay," he said. "Not for the summer. Not for the school term." He held her gaze without flinching. "Stay because this is where you belong. Because my boys need you, and this ranch needs you." A pause. A breath. "Because I need you. And I think you know that, and I think you've known it longer than I've been willing to say it. And I'm done not saying it." She looked at him. She looked at the yard where the boys were already back to their game, their voices rising and falling, in the particular music of children who were safe and well, and arguing about something that absolutely did not matter. She thought about the platform, the train whistle, the ring in her bag, and $4.62, and nowhere to go. She thought about a man who dried dishes in silence and sat up late, and told his dead wife's story in a quiet kitchen at midnight, and had looked at her just once, like she was something he had not expected and could not afford to take for granted. "I know," she said softly.
I've known for a while."
"And?" he said, very quiet. She looked at him. She let herself look at him, all the way, with nothing between them, none of the careful management she had maintained for weeks, because it had been necessary, and now was not. "And I'm not leaving," she said. He let out a breath, just one, slow and long, and the breath of a man setting something down that he had been carrying for a long time, without knowing how heavy it was. He reached over and covered her hand with his on the porch step, and she turned her hand over and let him. And they sat there in the summer afternoon with the boys' voices in the yard and the whole flat, enormous territory stretched out around them, and neither of them said another word, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The formal charges against Harold Briggs were filed in territorial court the following week. By month's end, 2 of his board members had quietly recused themselves from all municipal positions. Ed Weston's barn note had been transferred to a different lender, and the school board had voted unanimously, with 3 new members rapidly elected, to confirm Clara Merritt's appointment for the fall term. Briggs did not come to the yard again. He did not stop Clara on the street. She passed him once, outside the general store, and he looked at her with the flat, sealed expression of a man who had miscalculated and knew it, and would never say so. She nodded. She walked on. She did not look back. On the last Friday of August, Ruth came to supper with a bottle of something she refused to name and a look of satisfaction that could have powered the whole territory. May came too, and Mrs. Patterson, and Pete Harlow and his wife, and Frank Dodd, and the Millers, and Ed Weston, who shook Clara's hand and said, "Thank you, Miss Merritt," and meant it with his whole chest. The kitchen could not hold all of them, so they moved to the yard, and someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and the boys ran wild until they fell asleep against the fence post and had to be carried in, 1 each, 1 over Eli's shoulder and 1 over Clara's, up the stairs in the dark of the house, while the music continued outside. She tucked Danny in first. She smoothed the sheet over him and looked at his sleeping face, the trouble and the tenderness and the gray eyes that saw everything, and thought about the back porch and the summer night, and a small boy asking if dreams got better. "They do," she had told him, "much better." She stood up and turned, and Eli was in the doorway, Caleb already asleep against his shoulder, watching her with an expression that she no longer tried to name, because it was the same expression every time, and it meant everything. "Clara," he said, very quiet so as not to wake the boy. She said. "I'm glad you came to that platform." She crossed the room. She reached up and tucked Caleb's hair back from his sleeping forehead, the way she had tucked in 100 children in 100 classrooms, and her hand brushed Eli's arm in the doing of it, and neither of them moved back. "So am I," she said. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. September was 3 days away. The schoolhouse was 3 miles down the road. Her trunk was unpacked in the corner of this room, and she had not touched it in a month, and she did not intend to. Outside, the fiddle played on in the summer night, and the voices of people who had chosen to stand up and stand together carried across the yard and into the house, warm and real and entirely hers. Clara Merritt had come to Coldwater Creek with nothing and nowhere to go. She had found, in the place where she least expected it, exactly where she was supposed to be. And she held on to that with both hands, the way a woman holds on to the things that are worth keeping. And she did not let go.